He was an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a church usher, a man neighbors described as the last person you'd expect. On August 1, 1966, he climbed a 27-story tower with a footlocker of rifles, and for 96 minutes, he turned a university campus into a shooting gallery. The scariest part of this story isn't that a monster did it. It's that he wasn't one. Not before that morning. This video isn't about lifelong criminals or obvious psychopaths. It's about the ones nobody saw coming. The deacons, the decorated soldiers, the beloved dads, the Boy Scout leaders, ordinary, often genuinely good people who, under the right pressure, in the right moment, or over the wrong number of years, did something monstrous. Some snapped in a single day. Some planned for decades behind a smile. Psychologists have studied this exact phenomenon for 70 years, and the data is more disturbing than any one case. Almost anyone, under the wrong conditions, is capable of it. Here are 11 true stories that prove it, building to the one case that shows just how far good can fall. Charles Whitman had, on paper, the most wholesome resume imaginable. Altar boy. Eagle Scout by age 12, one of the youngest ever. A U.S. Marine with a sharpshooter's badge. A university student studying architectural engineering. Neighbors in Austin, Texas called him polite, calm, the helpful type. His wife Kathy described their marriage as happy. On the night of July 31, 1966, Whitman sat down and typed a letter. In it, he wrote that he didn't understand himself lately, that he'd been having overwhelming, violent thoughts he couldn't explain, and he asked that after his death, an autopsy be performed on his brain. Then he drove to his mother's apartment and stabbed her to death. He went home and stabbed his sleeping wife in the chest, 5 times. The next morning, dressed like a maintenance worker, he wheeled a footlocker of rifles, ammunition, food, and water up the elevator of the University of Texas Tower, 231 feet above the campus. He shot the receptionist at the observation deck. Then he shot 2 tourist families coming up the stairs. And then, just before noon, he started firing on the quad below. For the next hour and a half, Whitman picked off students, professors, and a mail carrier from a scope-mounted rifle, using the tower's ledges for cover, occasionally missing on purpose to keep rescuers pinned down before killing them anyway. He was, witnesses said, terrifyingly calm about it. Police officers and armed civilians eventually stormed the observation deck and killed him. In total, 17 dead, including the unborn child of a pregnant victim, and more than 30 wounded, in what's now considered one of the first mass school shootings in American history. The autopsy he requested found something real: a pecan-sized brain tumor, a glioblastoma, pressing against his amygdala, the brain's fear and aggression center. Doctors still argue today whether that tumor explains any of it, or whether it's a convenient answer to an impossible question. What's not in dispute is this: everyone who knew Charles Whitman before that day would have called him one of the good ones. That's the pattern you're about to see, again and again, for the next 40 minutes. But that wasn't even the most calculated case on this list, because at least Whitman's collapse happened in a single day. The next man planned his for months, with a smile on his face the whole time. In 1927, Andrew Kehoe was exactly the kind of man a small Michigan farming town relied on. He served on the school board. He was the district's treasurer. Neighbors called on him to fix their machinery for free. He'd even been elected to keep the local school's finances in order, the same school where 236 children studied every day. For over a year, using his access as a trusted school board handyman, Kehoe secretly wired the entire basement of the Bath Consolidated School with more than 500 pounds of dynamite and pyritol, a military surplus explosive. He worked in plain sight, a little at a time, so no single day's activity looked suspicious. He was, by every account, still smiling and helpful right up until the morning of May 18, 1927. That morning, he first murdered his wife, then set his own farm buildings ablaze, timed as a distraction to pull firefighters and neighbors away from the school. Then, at 8:45 a.m., he detonated the explosives packed into the school basement. The north wing collapsed onto the children inside. 38 elementary school children and 6 adults were killed. To this day, the deadliest attack on a school in American history, Deadlier than Columbine, deadlier than Sandy Hook. It gets worse. As rescuers dug through the rubble for survivors, Kehoe drove up in his truck, called a school official over, and detonated a second bomb hidden in his vehicle, killing himself, the superintendent, and several bystanders who'd rushed to help. Investigators later found a sign wired to his fence post, reading that criminals are made, not born. He believed, apparently, that a property tax dispute justified murdering an entire generation of a town's children. Quick recap before we go further. Whitman's collapse took one day. Kehoe's took over a year of quiet, methodical, invisible preparation, while everyone around him kept calling him a good man. Now here's where it turns from crimes of a single unraveling man to proof that this darkness lives in ordinary people by the thousands. John List looked, in 1971, like the most boring man in Westfield, New Jersey. An accountant, a Sunday school teacher, a church council member. Neighbors described him as stiff, formal, deeply religious, the kind of man who insisted his teenage daughter's acting ambitions were sinful. Quietly, List had lost his job months earlier and hadn't told his family, driving into New York each day to sit in train stations pretending to work while burning through his mother's inheritance. Rather than admit failure or seek help, he decided, by his own later confession, that murdering his entire family was an act of mercy, sparing them the shame of poverty and, he believed, saving their souls before they could sin further. On November 9, 1971, he shot his mother, then his wife, then each of his 3 children as they came home from school, one by one, over the course of the day, reportedly stopping to eat lunch in between. He arranged the bodies neatly in the ballroom of their Victorian mansion, turned on classical music to keep it playing for days, wrote a lengthy confession letter to his pastor explaining his reasoning, and drove away. He vanished completely. For 18 years. He built an entirely new identity, new name, new marriage, new church, new community that, once again, considered him a pillar of moral character, until a forensic sculptor's bust of what he'd look like decades later aired on America's Most Wanted in 1989, and a neighbor recognized him within days. He was arrested, convicted on all 5 counts, and died in prison in 2008, still insisting he'd done it out of love. Here's the retention hook worth sitting with. List didn't hide because he thought what he did was evil. He hid because he still believed it was righteous, and he spent 18 years being, once again, the most trusted man in a new town. If a personality that convinced can build an entire second life on a foundation like that, what does that tell you about how thin the line really is? Because it turns out, science has actually measured that line, and the results terrified the researchers who found them. In 1961, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram wanted to understand a very specific, very uncomfortable question. How did ordinary German citizens participate in the Holocaust? Were they monsters? Or was something else going on? He designed an experiment. Volunteers, regular people off the street, teachers, engineers, clerks, were told they were helping test memory and learning. They were instructed by a stern man in a lab coat to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another volunteer every time he got a question wrong. In reality, no shocks were real, and the other volunteer was an actor, pretending to scream in pain, then begging to stop, then eventually going silent, as if unconscious or dead. The lab coat never threatened anyone. He simply said, calmly, for times in increasing firmness, "Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must continue." That was the entire mechanism of control. No weapon. No real authority. Just a calm voice insisting. The result stunned Milgram and the entire field of psychology. Roughly 65% of participants, ordinary volunteers, not soldiers, not criminals, administered what they believed was a lethal 450-volt shock to a screaming, then silent, stranger, purely because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. Many were visibly distressed, sweating, laughing nervously, begging the experimenter to let them stop, and then continuing anyway. Milgram's chilling conclusion: obedience to authority can override a person's own conscience far more easily, and far more often, than anyone wanted to believe. This wasn't a study about a few bad apples. It was a study proving that the capacity lives quietly in most of us, waiting for the right authority figure to switch it on. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you see what happened when psychologists gave ordinary people a uniform and total power over other ordinary people. Because that experiment had to be shut down in less than a week. In 1971, Stanford psychologist Philip Zimbardo built a mock prison in a university basement and randomly assigned 24 psychologically healthy, average college students to be either guards or prisoners for a planned 2-week study. There was no violence allowed, no real stakes, no real crime, just roles, uniforms, and a fake jail. Within 36 hours, a prisoner had a breakdown so severe he had to be released. By day 2, guards were forcing prisoners into humiliating exercises, stripping privileges, using solitary confinement, a walk-in closet, as punishment. By day 5, guards had escalated to full psychological cruelty, forcing prisoners to simulate degrading acts, denying bathroom access, waking them for pointless midnight headcounts. These were not violent or troubled young men beforehand. They were selected specifically because they tested as stable and unremarkable. The experiment, meant to run 14 days, was shut down after just 6, not by the researchers noticing a problem on their own, but because a graduate student named Christina Maslick walked in, saw the conditions, and was horrified enough to confront Zimbardo directly, telling him what he'd built was no longer science, it was abuse. Quick recap and bridge. 2 separate psychology experiments, a decade apart, both found the same terrifying truth using totally different methods. Authority and uniforms can turn ordinary, decent people cruel astonishingly fast. But those were controlled studies with actors and no real stakes. The next 4 cases show what happens when the exact same psychological switch gets flipped for real, with real guns and real victims. This is where the video stops being about lab results and starts being about history's darkest hours. In 1942, German Reserve Police Battalion 101 was sent to occupied Poland. These were not elite SS fanatics. They were roughly 500 middle-aged German men, too old for the regular army, family men, factory workers, salesmen, truck drivers, many with no particular Nazi ideology, some who'd never even voted for Hitler. Historian Christopher Browning studied their surviving testimony in detail decades later in his landmark book on the unit. Their commanding officer, before their first mass shooting near the village of Josvow, gathered the battalion and gave them an extraordinary offer. Any man who felt he could not carry out the coming task. The mass execution of the village's roughly 1,800 Jewish men, women, and children could step out of formation, no punishment, no consequence. Only about a dozen men, out of nearly 500, stepped out. The rest spent the day marching Jewish villagers into the forest in small groups and shooting them at close range, one after another, all day, until the battalion had killed over 1,500 people by nightfall. Many vomited. Many broke down crying between rounds. Several later admitted in post-war testimony that they were horrified by what they were doing even as they kept doing it. And yet, over the following 18 months, this same battalion of ordinary men went on to participate in the killing of at least 83,000 people. Browning's research found something crucial. It wasn't primarily fanatical belief that drove most of these men to keep pulling the trigger. It was peer pressure, a fear of appearing weak or cowardly in front of comrades, deference to authority, and the simple horrifying momentum of everyone else is doing it. Almost none of them were monsters walking in. Nearly all of them became killers walking out. That's 4 separate proofs now, 2 lab experiments, and real atrocities, all pointing at the same mechanism. But there's one more twist buried in this story that makes it even darker. Obedience wasn't even required. They were offered a way out, and 97% of them didn't take it. If Reserve Battalion 101 shows what strangers with orders can do, Rwanda in 1994 shows something even more chilling. What happens when it's not strangers at all? Over roughly 100 days beginning in April 1994, an estimated 800,000 people, mostly ethnic Tutsis, were killed in Rwanda, largely by machete, largely by hand, largely by people who had lived next door to their victims for their entire lives. Teachers killed students. Priests handed parishioners over to death squads inside their own churches. Husbands in mixed marriages were pressured, sometimes at gunpoint, to kill their own Tutsi wives to prove loyalty to the Hutu power movement. State radio broadcasts played a constant, escalating role, urging ordinary citizens by name and neighborhood to do their duty, dehumanizing Tutsis as cockroaches for months beforehand, softening the psychological ground until mass participation felt less like murder and more like community obligation. Roadblocks went up in towns, manned not by soldiers but by neighbors, checking ID cards for ethnicity, deciding who lived and who didn't, block by block. Survivors have described, in devastating detail, being hidden by one neighbor while being hunted by another, sometimes literally next door to each other. This wasn't a war between armies. It was a genocide carried out, overwhelmingly, by civilians against people they'd shared markets, schools, and church pews with for decades, in one of the fastest mass-killing campaigns of the 20th century. Recap and bridge. We've now gone from one unraveling man, to a small experiment, to a battalion of 500, to an entire country's civilian population. The scale keeps widening, but here's the pivot for the second half of the video. The next 4 cases go back to something smaller and, in some ways, even more disturbing, because they're not about crowds or authority figures at all. They're about single men who spent years, sometimes decades, being loved by everyone around them while hiding something unspeakable. Marcus Wesson was, to his Fresno, California community, an unusually devoted father, a musician, a self-taught Bible scholar, a man who homeschooled his enormous extended family and who neighbors described as calm, spiritual, even charismatic. He had, by the early 2000s, fathered numerous children with his own daughters and nieces, all raised inside an isolated, tightly controlled household he ran like a cult of one. In March 2004, after a custody dispute finally brought police and social workers to his home, Wesson barricaded himself inside with several of his children. When officers finally entered, they found 9 of his children and grandchildren dead, shot in a back bedroom. An act prosecutors argued he orchestrated as a mass murder-suicide pact rather than allow the outside world to take his family from him. At trial, evidence painted a picture of decades of sexual abuse, control, and isolation hidden almost entirely from view. A man who presented as a devoted, if eccentric, family patriarch to anyone outside his walls, while conducting one of the most disturbing hidden abuse cases in American criminal history behind them. He was convicted on 9 counts of murder and is currently on death row in California. Quick gut check before the next one. Notice the pattern shifting. Whitman snapped in a day. Kehoe planned for a year. List vanished for 18. Wesson's horror ran for decades behind closed doors, and the next man on this list ran his for over 30 years, while holding a leadership position in his own church. For over 3 decades, the city of Wichita, Kansas lived in fear of a serial killer who called himself BTK. Bind, torture, kill. A man who taunted police and media with letters describing his murders in chilling, methodical detail, then went quiet for years at a time, then resurfaced. In February 2005, police finally identified BTK as Dennis Rader, a Cub Scout leader, a church council president at Christ Lutheran Church, a compliance officer for the city of Park City who wrote citations for overgrown lawns and unleashed dogs. Neighbors were flawed. His own wife of decades had no idea. His daughter later said she felt she'd been living with a stranger her entire life. Rader had murdered at least 10 people between 1974 and 1991, often stalking victims for weeks, breaking into their homes, and using rituals of control and restraint he'd later described to investigators with an almost clinical detachment he called his Factor X. He was ultimately caught not through DNA or informants, but through his own arrogance. He mailed police a floppy disk to taunt them, not realizing it contained metadata tracing directly back to his church's computer and his own first name. At his sentencing, Rader described his compulsions in a flat, almost bureaucratic tone, walking the courtroom through murders like meeting minutes. This was a man who, the same week he strangled a victim, could plausibly have been leading a Boy Scout troop meeting or handing out church bulletins. That contradiction, total ordinary respectability led directly over total monstrosity, is the exact thread running through every single case in this video. But nothing on this list compares to what happens when that same trusted, beloved leader pattern gets applied not to one family or one city, but to over 900 devoted followers who trusted him with their lives, and their children's lives, all the way to the very end. Before Jonestown became a synonym for the darkest possible outcome of blind faith, Jim Jones was, by many honest accounts, a genuinely progressive and beloved community leader. In 1950s and 60s Indianapolis, his People's Temple was one of the only fully racially integrated churches in the city. He adopted children of multiple races into his own family at a time when that was deeply controversial, personally desegregated hospital wards and restaurants through sheer public pressure, and built a devoted congregation around real, tangible social programs, soup kitchens, drug rehabilitation, elder care, free medical clinics. Civil rights leaders praised him. Local politicians courted his endorsement. Longtime members describe, without irony, a man who once seemed to genuinely want to build heaven on earth. That's what makes what happened next so much more devastating than a story about an obvious cult leader from the start. Over the 1970s, as scrutiny mounted over financial irregularities, staged faith healings, and reports of psychological and physical abuse within the temple, Jones relocated hundreds of his most devoted followers to a remote agricultural commune he'd built in the jungle of Guyana, naming it after himself, Jonestown. Isolated from outside contact, family, and independent information, followers who had once found real hope in his message increasingly found themselves trapped. Passports confiscated, mail monitored, white knight loyalty drills conducted at gunpoint in the middle of the night as rehearsals for exactly what was coming. On November 18, 1978, after temple members shot and killed a visiting U.S. Congressman, Leo Ryan, and several journalists at a nearby airstrip, Jones gathered his followers around a vat of grape-flavored drink laced with cyanide and sedatives. Survivors and audio recovered from the scene reveal Jones, in a flat, almost hypnotic tone, instructing parents to have their children drink first, describing the act not as death but as revolutionary suicide, a final act of protest against a world he'd convinced them had already failed them. In the end, 918 people died at Jonestown, the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. More than 300 of them were children, killed by parents who, months or years earlier, had followed this same man into a movement built on integration, compassion, and hope. Audio from the final hour reveals some members pleading, crying, resisting, and being told, calmly, repeatedly, that this was the only way. The same voice that once fed the hungry in Indianapolis was the last voice hundreds of families ever heard. Every single person in this video was, at some point, unmistakably one of the good ones, trusted, admired, even loved. That's not a coincidence, and it's not an excuse. It's the actual mechanism. Evil rarely announces itself with a warning label. It wears a scout uniform, sits on the church council, and waits for the exact right pressure, isolation, or permission to show its other face. If the fact that 97% of ordinary men chose to keep shooting even when given a free pass to walk away shook you the way it shook us, you need to see our deep dive on the Milgram Experiment's forgotten follow-up studies, where researchers tested exactly how far obedience actually goes. Drop a comment. Which case on this list scared you more, the ones who snapped in a day, or the ones who hid it for decades? See you in the next one.